going to talk to you a little bit about how this book came about, what the story's about, so that when I start talking to Judge Graham about this and start having him walk through the case, because we have somebody who lived through this story, and it was essential to my writing this book. And so I can ask him some of the questions about the more dicey parts of the book, some of the things he experienced. And I think it'll be interesting, but I think it's important to understand how this book came about and what is actually happening, so that when you have this conversation, it will make a lot more sense to you. So I can tell you that I had written another book called Devil in the Grove, which came out in 2012. And in 2012, April of 2012, I went down to Lake County and started going on tour talking about the book. And the very first book talk I did was in Groveland, the heart of Groveland, which was a little bit terrifying for me, frankly. I didn't really plan it out too well, because I just didn't think about it. I went right into the heart of Groveland, and I knew that nerves were a little bit raw about this story, and I didn't know who was going to be there. And so I remember walking towards the community center in Groveland, thinking, you know what, this is one of those talks I wouldn't mind if nobody showed up tonight. I was a little nervous about it. And then I started walking, and I saw one of those newspaper boxes on the sidewalk that said, literally, Author King here tonight. And I said, I guess people know about it now, so they're going to show up. And as I got a little closer to the building, there was a full parking lot, much like what we see here, and people milling about, and I knew there was going to be a lot of people there. And at that point, I started to really get nervous about it, because I was there by myself. And as I walked even closer, a woman came running out of the building, and she ran up to me, and she said, Mr. King, I'm so glad I caught you. I think it's only fair to tell you that we've had 2 death threats called in about you this evening. And my heart sunk. It was my first book talk, and I was very nervous. And she said, but you have nothing to worry about. We called the Lake County Sheriff's Department. I remember thinking, did this librarian not read the book? So I had an armed deputy standing beside me, which really didn't ease my discomfort very much. But it went fantastic, and it was a really great talk. And at the end of the night, I was signing books, which I'll be doing out there later, so you can come up to me and tell me stories and maybe give me some ideas of other stories to pursue. As I was signing books, there was an elderly gentleman who came up to me, big belt buckle on his, and he had a cowboy hat, and I'm thinking, oh boy, who's this guy? And he got up to me real close, and he took out a business card, and he stuck it right in my face. And all I could read, because it was so close, was Sheriff of Lake County. Yeah. And I said, oh no. And he said, I was a deputy on Willis McCall's force, and you got your book right. You got it right. He goes, but there's another story you didn't even mention, and nobody will talk about this story. This is the story of Jesse Daniels. And I said, I've heard the name. I've done, a lot of research in Lake County. Heard the name, but even I didn't know very much about it. I said, well, who was Jesse Daniels? And he said, this is a kid we framed in 1957 for a rape that he did not commit. And he goes, I'll tell you exactly how he did it. And he went on to tell me the details about this story of Jesse Daniels. He said, nobody will talk to you about this case because it involves very powerful people here in Lake County. People will talk about the Groveland story, but this is a very different matter, he told me. And people aren't going to talk to you about it, but I'll tell you what I know. And so he went on to tell me this story of young Jesse Daniels. And basically this book, what this book is really about, is it's about 8 years after the Groveland story took place. And it's in the aftermath of Brown versus Board, the most important civil rights decision the Supreme Court handled in the 20th century. This was a decision to desegregate the public schools. And what's really interesting about that, in the wake of this decision, what a lot of people don't realize is the country kind of took a step backwards after that. You saw the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You saw these white citizens' councils, 300,000 members across 11 states sprout out in opposition to desegregation. The number of incidents of racial terror really increased in the aftermath of Brown versus Board. So it was almost like the country took 2 steps forward and then a big step backwards. And so in the aftermath, this case happened in Lake County, in Sheriff Willis McCall's county, in the winter of 1957. What happened in this case? A very wealthy citrus baron by the name of Joe Knowles had a wife named Blanche Bosanquet Knowles. And one evening around Christmas of 57, Joe Knowles went out of town, and Blanche Bosanquet Knowles was sexually assaulted in her home while her 3 children slept in the house. And after the assault, she called deputies, and she gave a very accurate description of her attacker. She said he was an African American with bushy hair and very dark skin. And so what did Sheriff Willis McCall do? What he normally did. He rounded up about 24 African Americans in the black section of Okahumpka, threw them into jail, and started questioning him. And finally started narrowing down his suspects until they finally settled on the one suspect that they were going to go forward and prosecute. And that was the nephew of Virgil Hawkins, the man who had his case before the U.S. Supreme Court, who was trying to integrate the University of Florida College of Law. And he, too, was from Okahumpka, the same town where the Groveland story started out. So now you have 2 cases in Okahumpka that reach the U.S. Supreme Court, 2 separate civil rights cases. Something strange began to happen. Instead of bringing out Virgil Hawkins' nephew and charging him with this crime, the Lake County Sheriff's Department went silent. And in the middle of the night one night, they released Melvin Hawkins without fanfare. And they arrested a 19-year-old white, mentally disabled teenager by the name of Jesse Daniels. And Jesse Daniels was thrown in jail, and this was the beginning of a case. There was a reporter named Mabel Norris Reese. Many of you might know her as Mabel Norris Chesley, a columnist for the Daytona Beach News Journal. And she was living in Lake County, and she began to write about this case. And she began to suspect that there was a conspiracy at play, that Blanche Bosanquet Knowles was actually sexually assaulted by an African American. However, the social stigma of having this wealthy socialite, white woman, having been sexually assaulted by a black man was too much for her husband to handle. She would have become a pariah in the community, having been sexually assaulted by a black man. So what happened? Mabel began to suspect that the most powerful people in Lake County got together and decided to frame a white, mentally disabled person for a crime because it would have been more socially accepted for Blanche to have been sexually assaulted by a white person. And so that's what Mabel started writing. And she wrote about this, and she ran into all sorts of trouble in Lake County. Her house was bombed, her dog was poisoned, Klan threats constantly. They defaced and vandalized the newspaper offices. And ultimately what they did was they opened up, white supremacists in this town opened up a rival newspaper. And Sheriff Willis McCall went around warning all of Mabel's advertisers to no longer advertise in the Mount Dora topic. And that was the final straw for Mabel. They ruined her newspaper. And she had to sell it and move to Daytona Beach. And so this Jesse Daniels case lingered on because nobody was there to fight for this young man. And they sent him to Chattahoochee without a trial because they ruled him as being unable to help in his defense. And so they declared him insane and threw him in Chattahoochee, where he would spend 14 years. At the time when Mabel Norris Reese got basically run out of Lake County and moved to Daytona Beach, Pearl Daniels, Jesse's mother, also had similar run-ins. Her house was burned down. And so she decided to move to Daytona Beach too, to be a little closer to her friend Mabel. They were the only ones who really were fighting for Jesse after all these years. And one afternoon in 1969, Jesse Daniels' mother, Pearl, was walking along the beach, and she came up to an office for the Legal Services Department. And she walked into that office, and sitting there was a young lawyer, fairly fresh out of law school, named Richard Graham. And she went into Richard Graham's, sat down at his desk, and began to talk to him about her son's case and how she had gotten no relief for more than a decade. And so I guess my first question to Judge Richard Graham, who was a young lawyer at the time for legal services, what do you remember of that afternoon when this very poor woman stumbles in off the streets and wants to tell you about the story of her son?
Well, the first thing I remember is when she came in and asked to see me, and so they brought her back. And she said, she opened up with Mabel Norris Chesley, asked me to come see you. This was a new legal services program. It was a very small office. It was a federal program, OEO. But they left the control of the board with the Volusia County Bar Association in the beginning. And so there were all kinds of problems being created. But Pearl, I asked her about the case, of course, and she started talking to me about the horrible treatment her son had gotten. No lawyer really. They appointed a former prosecutor who the first thing he did was tell everybody his client was guilty. And he didn't arrange for her to, for Jesse to see anybody that might really help him. He just waived the witness presence at the, the grand jury proceeding. And he essentially had no attorney, no assistants, couldn't even talk to his parents. And so they managed to move him out to Chattahoochee and have him committed there in a criminal ward without a trial, without even a hearing. So that's, I frankly found that story kind of fantastic. I never knew that would ever happen anywhere in the United States with our Constitution and everything. But it did, and I soon found out it did. Now, what I told her, I said, I asked her if she had a lawyer, if Jesse had a lawyer. And she said, yes, he did. He was in Lake County, a man named Tom Champion. But she said, he's being run out of business. McCall and Odom have taken all his clients away from him. He can't do it anymore. And so I said, I'll have to call him and make sure that it's okay with him if I interfere with this. And so I did, and I called him, and he verified everything she told me. He said, I said, do you think he's innocent? He said, I know he's innocent. He was railroaded. And it was a tragic thing, and they're just about to run me out of town by having no clients anymore. And so he said, but call Mabel Norris Chesley. She's the one that won't accept this result, and she's the one who will never give up on this case until she gets him out. So I did call Mabel, and she spent a lot of time with me, giving me the horrible facts of this case and what happened there. And so I decided at that time to take the case.
And that was interesting because Mabel Norris Reese had a reputation in town. Willis McCall didn't have the kindest words for her. He called her Red Mabel because she was constantly writing about these communist things about criminal justice and society. And he would often say, she's just cursing me for being a white man. And in Mabel and Sheriff Willis McCall, they were two rivals. I mean, if you read Devil in the Grove, you could see the story starts out where Mabel is kind of repeating the words of the prosecutor and really telling the story that Sheriff Willis McCall wants out there. And later on, when the case is reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Robert Jackson, in his opinion, said this case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. He said, on those grounds, I would overturn this decision. And once he overturned that decision, Sheriff Willis McCall, who had basically promised the people of Lake County that these 4 young African Americans were going to go straight to the electric chair, now he's not delivering on his promise because that Supreme Court has overturned the decision. And so also in that decision, Justice Jackson really pointed to Mabel Norris Reese as accused her of biasing the entire community and the jury pool by poisoning the jury pool by her inaccurate stories. And Mabel later on said, I deserved to be stepped on in that case. I wasn't doing my job as a journalist. And from that moment on, she decided that she was going to stand up to Willis McCall, especially after he shot two of the Groveland boys on the side of the road on the evening of their retrial. So now she was all in, and she was just going to use her newspaper to report justice. And so she kept on top of this Jesse Daniels case, even when she was run out of town. It was her passion. And there was really nobody, I think, more qualified than to continue to write about Sheriff Willis McCall than Red Mabel. But I'm wondering what it was like for you. All of a sudden, you're this lawyer, and all your friends and maybe people at your law firm are saying, what are you hanging around with Mabel Norris Chesley? I mean, it must have been a strange moment in your community.
Yeah, an exception is the people in the law firm didn't, because I went over with them. When I left legal services and went back into that firm, my father was a partner, I told them the one condition I would come back is that they would let me bring this case, because there was nobody left in legal service that could or would handle it. And so they agreed, and I came back in the firm, and that's when I started working from there. Now, what was the...
Well, I was going to say, what were the challenges that you faced right off the bat? Now you have this
Okay.
man that you believe, or a young man
Okay.
who you believe is innocent, but like, how do you start the case?
Okay, I started it, fortunately, with the support of that firm, and particularly with a partner in the firm named Ted Husfeld. And he convinced the rest of them that the firm should take it. I said, he has no money. I have no money. I just got out of the Army basic training. I can't, I knew that to win it, we would have to spend $10,000 or $20,000, and they said, well, if you think he's innocent, go ahead and take it. We'll let you handle it pro bono. So that's the only reason I could even continue working on it. I could have worked on it and given my services away, but I couldn't have paid all those doctors. But with the rest of the community, like Gilbert said, particularly the lawyers, what are you doing hanging around with Red Mabel? And I said, because I was a Republican. and so I said, I'm not hanging around with her. I'm trying to get a innocent man out of the nut house. And so they cooled off some. I mean, they didn't know whether he was innocent or not, but they knew I thought he was. And so I got an excuse for hanging around with Red Mabel.
And so your earliest effort, I mean, you went to the Florida Supreme Court, and you argued oral arguments before the Florida Supreme Court as a young lawyer, and you're waiting to hear. How long did you have to wait before you heard the decision after your initial arguments?
I can't remember exactly how long it was, but it was quite a while, and it was coming up on Christmas. And so Pearl came to see me and said, do you think we'll know by Christmas? And I said, I don't know. And she said, could you call the court? A lawyer is never going to call a judge. That's not a smart thing to do. So I didn't do that. But I did call the clerks. And then all of a sudden, I'm on the phone with Chief Justice Irwin. And he said, I said, ooh, I wouldn't have done that. And he said, I wanted to talk to you. He said, we ruled against you today, or yesterday. And he said that it was a 4-1 decision, and he wrote a dissent. And so he went on to talk to me about it, and his dissent said that the Florida Supreme Court, should review we challenged the constitutionality of the commitment statute and the indictment and other things. He said we should have heard the merits of the law and the facts, and he wrote that dissent. But he said to me, he said, you're right and we're wrong, and I hope you won't stop here. So that encouraged me to keep working on it very hard.
And you reached pretty high. Where did you file your next brief with?
Well, how I got to the Florida Supreme Court, and the first step was that I filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus. I did a little research, and you can file that at any level in the state court system. And so I decided, why would I go over to Lake County and get my head beat in when I can go up Tallahassee? And so that's how we got there. But when we lost it there, Mabel and others said, okay, but they did give me the right to have another hearing in Lake County, a real hearing, where we would have our experts and they could testify, and if he's competent to go to trial, that was the standard. If he's competent to understand the charges and assist his attorney, then he is not insane, and he or she may go to trial. And it's very rare for a defendant wanting to go to trial and the state attorney trying to stop it. But anyway, we found some case law that says when you take a statute, a state statute, and you allege it's unconstitutional under federal constitutional mandates, and if you lose in the state, you have a direct appeal to the United States Supreme Court. You don't have to go through any of the lower courts, or you have a direct appeal. So we said, well, why are we going to go to those lower courts? And we went right to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they took the case, which made it the third Oklahoma case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right, there's no legal landscape like this in America. Oklahoma is about the size of a couple football fields. Population of maybe 250, 300, and there are 3 separate civil rights cases within a 10-year period that reached the U.S. Supreme Court, all at the hands of Willis McCall. He was responsible for all of them. And so, like I said, there's no legal landscape like this, and now the U.S. Supreme Court has sent an order back to Florida, an order to show cause, demanding that Florida explain why they are holding Jesse Daniels without a trial. And that starts this whole process.
Right. And it did. And I think the state filed a response to that, and I responded to that. And then the case was sitting there, but we got, not for too long, because we fairly quickly got the order to show cause, which means they've taken the case. And they said, show cause why you shouldn't release him, and show cause why we shouldn't void that statute. And so that's an indication the state of Florida is going to lose that case. And they knew it, and and they told me so later.
Right. And so now you get to go to Lake County, lucky you, right?
Right.
And I mean, you didn't really know much about Lake County, right? You spent most of your life in Volusia County at that point. And so Lake County was like this foreign land that you weren't really familiar with.
Right.
And describe what that was like, the introduction into Lake County criminal justice.
It was unusual. Before I went over there, we had to bring Jesse down from Chattahoochee. And everybody was worried because about half the people McCall transported to court got killed on the way there. Yeah. And so the sheriff of Volusia County, if you've been here long enough, you probably remember him, Ed Duff. Okay. He called me in and he said, you better not, he said, first be very careful over there. Then he said, you should not allow McCall to bring Jesse Daniels to that hearing because he probably won't make it. And so I went over and asked the court to allow Ed Duff to transport him. Ed volunteered, and he did. I did get an order, and so that's the way it happened. And that's when Ed Duff gave me a card appointing me a special deputy of Volusia County, and said if they stop you over there, you put it by your driver's license and you just hand both of them to them. So that's how it happened. That they transported Jesse. And the best thing about that was they transported him to the DeLand jail, not Tavares. And and they probably knew he was innocent, the DeLand people, so they were very open in letting anybody see him. We wanted them to, because we had to get our witnesses together, because all of the witnesses at Chattahoochee were either not going to be there or not going to be friendly. And so we got a wide range of expert witnesses, two or three psychiatrists, board certified PhD psychologists, cops, criminologists, and we were prepared to put on a dog and pony show, which we did.
And I think one of the most interesting stories, early on you win, in a hearing, you win the right to actually take Jesse's medical records from Chattahoochee and look at them and begin evaluating and doing your own research for this case. And there's one moment where after you get the order certified, giving you access to these files up at Chattahoochee, Ted Husfeld and you come out of the courthouse and you have a little conversation. What was that about?
Well, we had a certified copy of the order, and this was in about noon probably, and so this was about noon, and Ted said, "Get in the car," and I said, "Well, where are we going?" He said, "Chattahoochee," and I said, "Now?" And he said, "Yeah, now. Those records won't be there tomorrow," and that I'm sure was true.
Right, and if you looked at the power of two state attorneys in Lake County who were really advocating on behalf of the Knowles family and the powers that be in Lake County and not Jesse Daniels. This thought that Ted had was not unrealistic. Records were disappearing constantly, and it was a really smart thing for him to get up there because I'm not sure those records would have been there.
I'm pretty sure they would not have been there because McCall had already claimed he lost all the records of the Jesse Daniels case. We moved the office, they must have gotten lost or something like that. And then Odom couldn't even find, Odom would send, he took the confession, not the confession, but the statement of the victim and sent it up to the people in Chattahoochee. And so when we looked for those records, and the cover letter was there, but the report wasn't. And so then he lost most of his records too. So the whole case, we were fighting against lost records and judges who wouldn't do anything about it.
Right. And the interesting thing about this, sometimes when you write these kind of books, you have to get a little bit lucky with your research because sometimes things just happen. The fact that you're involved in them, I've heard, I could tell you stories about how some of these records came about. I'll give you one example. I was on Facebook one night, and I got a Facebook message from a guy. And he basically tells me, he goes, "Oh, you know what? This is a couple of years after Devil in the Grove is out." He said, I just wanted to write you because one of my friends said, you really ought to read this book. It takes place in Central Florida, and it involves Sheriff Willis McCall. And he said, I actually arrested Sheriff Willis McCall in 1972 in Lake County. I was the head of an organization that was investigating him. And I said, "Oh, this is really interesting because I'm writing a book about that time period and you might be a great person to talk to." And he said, "I am a great person to talk to. I was in charge of the whole investigation on Willis McCall." Told me all about this story. And I said, "Well, one of the worst parts of it is all those records are missing from the files. That we were told there was a flood or something, but they're all gone for like a 2-year period in the early 70s. And I'm never going to get my hands on these many thousands of pages of documents and investigations." And I told him that, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I thought this was the most fascinating case I ever worked on. I made copies of every single record. I have it in my garage." And so about a week later, I was in this garage going through these files. Everything was in there, including all the things that Mabel Norris suspected, this grand conspiracy. There was smoking gun material in there, informants who had ratted out their friends in the conspiracy. So it was a remarkable find. There was one episode after another like this about getting lucky. Surely Willis McCall's not going to save his police files for some lawyer to look at later or some New York writer who's going to re-examine it. So he obviously had a barbecue. But now I had a deputy who was involved and on the force, and he was giving me the inside account of the deputies and how they framed Jesse Daniels, how they did little things like Jesse played the guitar. So what they did was they snuck into his house while he was in jail and his parents were visiting him, and they stole guitar picks out of his house and brought it over to Blanche Bosanquet-Knowles' house and put the guitar picks on the floor there, linking Jesse to this. Now, there was never a trial, so this never came to pass. They didn't need this evidence. But it gave you an insight as to what the Lake County Sheriff's Department was really looking for. So those are a couple ways that I got lucky. The luckiest way I got was running into Richard Grant, Jesse's lawyer, who remembered everything clearly as a bell. Every once in a while, I'd have to refresh his memory, send him some documents, but not often. And usually what happened in the writing of this book, and I'll skip forward to a moment because I think this really tells a great story about how you collaborate with your primary source. I was working on this for years. I don't know how he had the patience to answer every idiotic question, but I would hit him with them constantly. And later on in the process, I started to show him drafts of what I was writing. And there's a moment in this story that I think if you were a novelist and you put it in a novel, people would think that you were just being ridiculous and faking things so badly it's not believable. But that's what's great about nonfiction. Sometimes these things happen, and they really did happen. And the fact that it's nonfiction makes it, I think, even stronger. But there's a moment, I'm skipping ahead to the legislative hearing that they had, the Florida legislature, because Jesse Daniels does not go to a trial. The legislature is going to determine his innocence or guilt. And at one point in the hearing, you were cross-examining the court stenographer, and the court stenographer is the person who took Jesse Daniels' confession way back in 1957. Jesse Daniels signed it, and she notarized it and put it into the record. And now, 14 years later, you are questioning this stenographer from Lake County. Can you just describe that scene and what followed?
Okay, that scene followed, but just before it was the testimony of polygraph.
Oh, the polygraph expert from Tampa.
Yeah, polygraph.
Right.
And he had interviewed about 20 people probably in the jail, and only one of them showed deception, and that was in a file marked Jesse Daniels. And so what he did, he sat in the chair, he was comfortable, he didn't stutter, he wasn't nervous, and everybody knew Jesse Daniels always stuttered and would not be talking like this transcript said he was. And this guy was just saying he did take the polygraph of a guy that they told him was Jesse Daniels. And the guy confessed to everything, and it was just like, it was just another night out on the town. And so the special magistrate was really kind of concerned about that. I mean, here's the guy confessing and not making a big deal out of it and everything. And so the next witness after the polygrapher, the notary who took the statement, notarized the statement, and testified about the statement, how he was calm, he didn't stutter, that. And so I thought, well, this doesn't sound like Jesse Daniels, so I had a picture of him when he was 19. That's how old he was when the rape occurred. So I handed it to her, and I said, does this picture mean anything to you when you look at it? And she said, I've never seen this guy before in my life. And so I said, well, would you describe for the special magistrate what the Jesse Daniels looked like? And she started out by saying he had kinky black hair, and everybody knew Jesse Daniels had straight, brown hair. And she said he was a dark Negro, like dark brown. And everybody, the special magistrate just called a recess. Everybody left. And the lawyers all met in the room with the special magistrate, and they just didn't, everybody was shocked, including me. I knew that wasn't Jesse Daniels that polygrapher took it, but I didn't know that it was
Right.
It was jiggled around like that, where McCall and Odom would have a black guy confess and tell people he was Jesse Daniels on a tape, thinking no one was going to catch him on it. But so anyway, the polygrapher was then called back in, and he said, I'm sorry, but I did not give a polygraph to any white people. They were all Negroes. And so that kind of blew his prior testimony up, where, you know, he was talking about Jesse Daniels indicating guilt.
And what was remarkable is that the special master, when he called the recess, it was totally confusing. Nobody knew what was happening. And the special master's walking around the chamber going, someone ought to write a book. It's like, be patient.
Right.
But there was also something to that, because the polygraph expert, I mean, he was really nervous now. He said, I only interviewed white or black suspects. I didn't interview any white people. And when the stenographer said the same thing, everybody kind of knew that something was foul in Lake County. And so you had this idea, or you and the team had this idea to further investigate this. And so you went to a cafe outside of town, and you brought the stenographer and also Jesse Daniels to that cafe. And all the lawyers were there from the state and also the defense lawyers. And what happened in that cafe?
Okay, they came in separately, separate cars. They sat at separate tables. And then when everybody was there, they brought them together at a table, sitting across from each other. And we asked them, do you know each other? Have you ever seen each other? And they said, no, both of them. No, we had never seen him or never seen her in my life. And so then she figured it out. I mean, she said, there'd be no other reason for all those cops being there and lawyers if it wasn't about the Jesse Daniels case. And she said, is this Jesse Daniels? And we nodded yes. And she collapsed almost. I was sitting there watching it, and Mabel was too. And she started breathing poorly, and her legs were falling out from under her. And she said, it was a Negro whose confession I witnessed. I watched the Negro sign the confession and notarized it. And so that's how Yates and McCall worked.
Right.
They faked evidence. They changed it. They're trying to fool the world that they could get a black guy to confess saying he was Jesse Daniels and no one would challenge it.
Right, and that was the length of the conspiracy in order to put Jesse Daniels away, only so that this family could have the benefit of not having Blanche be a pariah in this high society of Lake County. This was the lengths they were willing to go to, and that stenographer was very adamant. She says, Deputy Yates tricked me. He tricked me in that room. And if you read Devil in the Grove, Deputy Yates was the one who fabricated the footprints and later got caught on that, fabricating the footprints of the Groveland boys and putting them at the crime scene. And so this is a sheriff's department that was out of control for the most part, and it was all done at the behest of Sheriff Willis McCall and his one main deputy investigator, James Yates. There was many instances like this. I can't really go through all of them in this short period of time, but one of the instances, I think, when you begin to see the depravity involved in this case, is a moment where Willis McCall, after he arrests 24 African Americans from Okahumpka and slowly starts releasing them to arrest Jesse Daniels, one of the people that they released in that group of young African Americans was a young man named Wiley Sam Odom. And Wiley Sam Odom was released with the rest of the suspects. And the Lake County Sheriff's Department knew about Sam Wiley Odom. And they believed that he confessed to raping Blanche Bozaquet Knowles. But in order to put this conspiracy in place, they had to release Sam Wiley Odom. And so what does Sam Wiley Odom do shortly after his release? he sexually assaults another person in the vicinity of Lake County. This time he's caught. This time he's tried, convicted, and sent up to Rayford State Prison to await the electric chair. Mabel learns about this and wonders, why is the Lake County Sheriff's Department not connecting these two cases that happened weeks apart, both of them involving very similar sexual assaults, and Lake County deputies and Sheriff's Department does not want to connect them. So Mabel drives up to Rayford State Prison and begins to interview Sam Wiley Odom about 3 days before he's about to go to the electric chair. And Sam Wiley Odom, who knew Jesse and lived not far from him, begins to tell a story. And the story basically is that Jesse Daniels isn't guilty, and he knows something, and he's holding something. And basically the story is, he tells, a man paid me $5,000 to kill Blanche Bosanquet Knowles. But when I went in the house, there was a baby sleeping at the foot of the bed, and I couldn't go through with the killing. And he describes this conversation with Blanche Bosanquet Knowles. One of those documents that was missing for 30 years was the statement from Blanche Bosanquet Knowles. It turned up decades later. I got a copy of it. It's 7 pages long. And everything Sam Wiley Odom told Mabel, Blanche Bosanquet Knowles told almost the exact same thing in her statement. She didn't describe a young white person who was stuttering. She described her attacker as being an African American. And she went through this whole conversation, and the conversation also included this admission from Sam Wiley Odom that he was paid $5,000 to kill her. And he says to her, to Blanche, wouldn't you like to know who paid me that money? And Blanche says, well, if it will get you out of my house faster, yes. And then he says, oh, you're going to be sassy? Now I'm not going to tell you. And he leaves. And so this was what Mabel was going on. And Mabel's writing these stories saying, there's someone in Rayford State Prison who's about to go to the electric chair who knows about this case. And they could not stop the progress. Willis McCall, the state attorney, Gordon Oldham, just moved this case right through. And you see the unlikely outcome in this case, Sam Wiley Odom and Mabel fighting for this. And you know, that was not the end. That was early on in the case, and Mabel still stayed on this. And I'm wondering what it was like for you, because you had to go back into Lake County at one point and confront basically that whole criminal justice system. Sheriff Willis McCall, Gordon Oldham, and you didn't know really much about Lake County in those early days. What was that like going back there?
Well, you're right, I didn't know much. I lived right across the river in DeLand, but it wasn't the same. And I was kind of shocked to see this, where there were lynchings in DeLand, but I didn't know growing up that was going on. I heard there was a Klan, but I didn't know. But over there were a lot of lynchings and a lot of cruelty and just horrible racism by people who were elected to protect the citizens. The sheriff, the state attorney, elected, and they go into a conspiracy to destroy a family of 3. They weren't fancy, they weren't rich, but they were good people. But to save a society lady from the stigma they thought of being raped by a Negro.
You know, it reminds me, there was a quote from Thurgood Marshall, a very simple quote, and I used to hear it a lot, and it never really made much sense to me. The quote was, Marshall said, "Racism benefits no one." And I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, racism has benefited a lot of people over the years. I mean, if you look at American history, racism, you know, this country was kind of built on the back of racism and exploitation and white supremacy. And then as I was really working on this story, that quote meant something different to me. Racism benefits no one. And you look at what happened in Lake County. If you were on the wrong side of Sheriff McCall, who was trying to prop up this system of white supremacy, that's what he was in power for. That was his mission in Lake County, was to ensure white supremacy. there's going to be casualties on every side of this. Certainly you cannot compare the racial terror that African Americans experienced with what whites were experiencing. But if you look at Lake County, if you're Jesse Daniels, if you're Mabel Norris Reese, if you're Tom Champion, the lawyer who's trying to represent Jesse Daniels, your life is basically ruined because you're on the wrong side. And you're run out of town. There's plenty of white people who were killed by Willis McCall because they were testifying against him in court. And this is the pattern you see. And basically, really what it comes down to, this story is all about race, but it's twisted on its head, and it's inverted, and it doesn't look the same as a lot of the racial stories that we're used to. But this is the kind of story that shows you the depravity of what was happening in a county like Lake County at the time. In order to prop up this white supremacy, there were going to be victims on all sides because it's untenable. And I think that's what you see in Lake County, where the most powerful person in the county is the elected sheriff. He is answerable to the electorate, and the electorate is a very rural community that was looking for white supremacy to be propped up. And that's what you see in a lot of counties, not just Lake. Lake just looks really bad because of one person, Sheriff Willis McCall. And the reason was he was so flamboyant and so many brags about having been investigated 49 times by the Department of Justice for civil rights violations. And he took great pride that he was able to beat every single one of those. And he did. Later on in the case, he was indicted for murder. He kicked to death a black mentally disabled prisoner in his own jail, someone who had a failure of an emission sticker for his car. It was a very minor thing, and this led to the man's death. And Reuben Askew suspended him from office. He was indicted, brought to trial, and acquitted in less than an hour. And when the FDLE went around to interview the jurors, because they thought they had an airtight case, they interviewed the jurors who told them to a man that Willis McCall probably was guilty, but we got to live down here. That was the message that was sent. And it didn't matter that that case happened outside of Lake County. That was moved to a different venue. It was still Central Florida, where Willis McCall controlled the Ku Klux Klan. And so that's how you're able to see this form of justice thrive for so long. Willis McCall was in office for 28 years. It wasn't until 1972 that he was suspended from office. And so that was the legacy of Willis McCall. And that's what really helps explain how a story that's this perverted in terms of race and criminal justice can occur. It's because it happened in Willis McCall's territory, where they felt that they could get away with everything, because they did. We'll try and end on a brighter note, because you were very successful in what you did. You actually won Jesse Daniels his freedom after 14 years in Chattahoochee. The state legislature exonerated Jesse Daniels after a very thorough investigation and a very thorough hearing. And there were some really great changes that happened in the wake of Jesse Daniels' agony. The most, I think, important one is your meeting with a legislator from South Florida by the name of Maxine Baker. And can you talk about Maxine Baker and her role in this case?
Maxine Baker was not a lawyer, but she was chairman of a subcommittee on mental health and retardation. And she was very worried about the Florida system, the same way we were when we saw they could railroad somebody without showing they were dangerous, or without showing that they might hurt themselves or anybody else, but just if they're charged with a crime. So everybody knows that's wrong, including the Supreme Court of the United States, who were very ready to trash that law. But it was a mission for her as chairman of that committee to rewrite the mental health laws, and where there was due process and equal protection for people with mental illnesses. And I never considered retardation a mental illness, but that's categorized in there too, and it's okay with me as long as the statute's fair. So she called me up. This is after we got Jesse out, and probably, I'm not sure if it's before or after the claim bill, but he was out. And so she asked me to come up there and write the law, help her do that, because she was not a lawyer. And so I did. I went up there a couple times and wrote what I thought we needed to do. And they made some changes to it, but it basically was still a vast improvement. And it passed, and it was known as the Baker Act, which we're under right now. Yeah. I know that one thing, as I was a judge for about 11 years, and I did a lot of Baker Acts. I volunteered to do them because I was, and these lawyers would come in and say, that's not what the legislature, that's not what the Baker Act was intended to do. That's not what it means to me as a judge. And I said, it's what it meant when I wrote it.
And what's really interesting is that Baker Act served as a model for many other states who really modeled their own legislature and protections for patients and those accused of crimes to have criminal protection and rights, mental health rights. So that was a really important, it was the Florida Mental Health Act, but it's known as the Baker Act. And that was the one that was really designed in the wake of Jesse Daniels and this other inmate, I guess you call him an inmate, at Chattahoochee, who stayed there even a little longer than Jesse Daniels. He was there for 15 years, and he did something remarkable. He kept notes of his entire stay there, every doctor interaction, and so he was able to bring lawyers, once he got out, he was able to bring lawyers a really detailed record of the abuses at Chattahoochee and the lack of actual evaluations. And so that was instrumental in the Baker Act. Not only that, I think Jesse Daniels passed away just last year, and so I had the benefit of interviewing him several times. When I first heard that this man had a severe stutter and that his IQ was very low and that he was slow, he was developmentally challenged, and all of that was true. But as I was interviewing him, he had long pauses, but he was also kind of like on the spectrum a little bit. So if you saw Rain Man, you could sort of understand. He could remember names of deputies, the cars they drove, really details about his case that I didn't trust. When he first started telling me this, I said, no, this is not right. I'll have to double check all this. And I would look at it and go, God, he got that right. How did he remember that deputy's name? That deputy's been dead for 40 years. But he remembered a lot. And so he was much more useful than I thought he would be. And ultimately, we were able to get him together with Richard Graham. Maybe a couple years ago, we met in the church.
Right.
And this is kind of a sad but funny story in a way. We really weren't quite sure how Jesse Daniels would recall this. And we were sitting having coffee at a table in the church waiting room. And I introduced Jesse. I said, you might remember Richard Graham. Do you remember him? And there was a long pause. And, I could see Jesse just kind of sitting there stumbling a little bit, not really sure where to go next. And I could see I was looking over at Richard, and I said, oh, it's kind of unfortunate. It looks like Jesse doesn't quite remember. And I waited a little bit because he's slow to respond. And then I started to move towards the next question. And Jesse kind of jumped in and interrupted. And he said, Mr. Graham, you still have that blue sports car, the Dodge? And that's about the look I got. It was great. And they remembered each other. It was really beautiful. But
the hesitation, he just was trying to think what kind of car it was, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But he got it. I mean, that was the one we used. But I think we're kind of running low. I think we should go to a couple questions here. Anybody have any questions they want to ask either myself or Judge Graham? Feel free to jump in. First one's always, this guy right here. Well, that's an interesting, the question was, did they ever find out who paid Sam Wiley Odom to do this? I don't want to give away too much of a spoiler because, yeah, it's in the book, but there are a couple of really strange twists in it, and I don't want to give it away, but if you ask me privately, I'll be happy to tell you. But I will say this. I'm going to say maybe, all right? I leave it open, but I think most people have an opinion about what happened in there. But here's one story that I will tell you. I had always heard that Joe Knowles was out having an affair with a woman the night his wife was sexually assaulted. But you know, when I started researching this, I'm like, I'm never going to find out the answer to this. You know, everybody's dead. It's too long ago. And I finally filed a Freedom of Information Act request. I wanted to see the FBI files, and these take a long time to clear. So it was about 3 years into my research when I finally got the call that these FBI files were ready. And so I did what everybody does when you get that call. You go right to the National Archives, and they'll give you the file. And you sit there at the desk, and you start reading the files, because it's stuff, now you know the case. And you're like, wow, what's going to be in here? I have no idea. And so sure enough, I'm flipping through it, and there's an FBI report, and they interviewed the woman who was having an affair with Joe Knowles on that night that his wife was sexually assaulted. And so now I have the name. And so I did the first thing that any of you would do, pulled out my cell phone and Googled her. Right? That's what all the great research starts that way. And I'm not kidding you, talk about getting lucky. I Google it, and I see, oh my God, she went on to a 20-year career as a Florida legislator. And so at the time of this affair, she was a young aide in Washington, like a political aide for a Florida senator or congressman. And surprisingly, she was still alive and living in Tallahassee. I think she was 96 years old. So I call her up. And I'm sure she's thinking, here's a nice young reporter who's going to ask me about all the things I did for women's rights and the environment and all that. And no, I'd like to talk where the FBI thought you were a suspect in a murder for hire case back in 1957. And she literally gasped. And she said, that's what you're asking me? And I said, yes, I'm really sorry to do it, but I went through the FBI records and, you know, and she thought about it for a while, and she said, what do you want to know? And she said it was all true, that she had had an affair with Joe Knowles, and she admitted to it. And she went on to tell me details of how the relationship went, how guilty she felt having this affair when she knew that Joe's wife had been sexually assaulted back home, and she felt responsible for that. And she broke off the relationship at that point, and she told the FBI. The FBI was investigating her to see if she had paid $5,000 to eliminate Blanche. And so they went through a whole investigation for this. And she admitted to everything, and we had a very long conversation. And unsurprisingly, I think sometimes when you interview people and you really care about their lives, they tell you things. And I was about to hang up, and she said, Mr. King, there's one other thing I didn't tell you. I said, oh? She said, I had an affair with JFK, too. You know I'm writing a book, don't you? So now, like, spent another week, like, trying to research that, and that all lined up. She described the buildings and the cars that JFK was driving. But those are the kind of, if you really get obsessed with the research like I tend to do, this is the kind of research that's just great because now she's bringing it to life. And one of the things I thought she said that was, you know, this is real life. She said to me, she knew what I was doing, and she said, be kind to old Joe. He was a good man. He was a good man. And that was her message. Like, she wanted me to like, just paint him in a favorable way. And I'm thinking,
may I make one comment on
yes.
Mary Ellen? I served in the legislature for 4 years, and she was there. We were both Republicans, and we were good friends, and neither one of us, I didn't know she was involved in it. She didn't know I was involved in it. Never said a word, because this was before the book, obviously.
Right. Yeah, and then, you know.
And she was a good legislator and a good person.
Anybody else have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, all right. That's one less I have to sign tonight. That's great. Thank you for coming. Right. Well, I mean, well, I'll let you speak about the events that happened in Europe, but I can tell you, if you read Devil in the Grove, you see the real terror. Right after the trial, the African-American lawyers get in the car and they're trying to get back. There's no hotels in Lake County where African-Americans can stay. They didn't even have any friendly people that they felt that they could even lean on. It was such a rural, white-dominated county. And so they were staying at the Wells-built Hotel in Orlando, which was the only hotel in Orlando that would take African Americans. And so they had to drive, I think it was like over an hour back in those days to get back to friendly confines of Paramore in Orlando. And right after the trial, Klansmen in cars start chasing the lawyers. And it's a 90-mile-an-hour high-speed chase through Central Florida to get back to Paramore. And Franklin Williams, one of the lawyers, I mean, they pull in, it's like 11 o'clock at night, they pull into Paramore. Franklin Williams just jumps out of the car and says, "I've never been more excited to see so many black people in my life." I mean, just absolutely terrified. And there were journalists in that car. You know, clearly, you know, you weren't safe knowing what your mission was going into Lake County. But you didn't stand out so much as an African-American lawyer might stand out. What was it like for you going into this, I would call it enemy territory for a lawyer standing up to the state?
Well, it was somewhat scary, for sure. And my wife, who's sitting over there, was more concerned than I was, I guess, because she was 8 months pregnant then with our first child when I was handling this case. And then she's been hearing how tough those guys were over there. So she said, "How do you know they're not going to come after you?" And you never know, but it's not that. I lived in Volusia County. They couldn't intimidate me as much as they could Mabel and Tom Champion, because I was in a law firm that wouldn't care a thing about Willis McCall or Gordon Odom. I can promise you that. And so they weren't going to do me much harm over here. Over there, I think it would have been so suspicious, just like Mabel said. If someone killed me, you know, everybody would know who did it. No one had any reason to kill me except them. And that's...
Yeah, but you know, again, like the 49 cases that Willis McCall has beaten, you know, this was a reality. I mean, he was never held accountable for any of this stuff throughout his entire 28-year reign. And in fact, after Willis McCall lost an election by not a very large amount, his words were, "If I didn't have that damn murder trial, I would have won easily because I could have been campaigning more." But his son ended up becoming sheriff, and that was all about keeping the McCall name in power. Everybody knew who the real power in Lake County was, even though Willis McCall was no longer the man in the sheriff's office. So anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
Have you been approached by Netflix or Amazon or Hollywood to release this screen?
Yes.
Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about it. Amazon actually had the rights to Devil in the Grove, but there's been a lot of changeover at Amazon, and so they're no longer doing it. So we're out there looking again, and actually, we think it's a good opportunity because people our age don't go to the movies as much anymore. They watch television. They watch these series. And so now we're starting to look at one long series about Lake County that would encompass both of these stories. And so we're starting to think about that. So it might be an opportunity to be able to get a film out there or a television show where people our age will watch. Yes, ma'am. How did I first, well, I'll just give you the brief answer to that, is that I was kind of surprised because when I first found out about it, I started looking into it, and I kept looking at Thurgood Marshall's biographies, and it was getting like maybe a paragraph at most. And I remember thinking, this case is more dynamic than the Scottsboro Boys, the case in Alabama from 1931, where 9 African Americans are wrongly accused of rape and convicted, and it starts this whole legal process where it's decades and decades until they're exonerated. In this particular case, it's the same kind of accusation about these 4 African Americans, but in this case, the sheriff starts to kill them. And it just seemed to me so much more violent, so much more dynamic. You have the story of Harry T. Moore, who's working with Thurgood Marshall, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the trial, the Klan puts a bomb under his home, killing both him and his wife. And it was strictly related to this Groveland case where 4 people were killed in the middle of the trials. And so I just thought, wow, this case has not really been written about. And it sort of reminded me about the richness, that's a good word to describe this, the number of stories that come out of Florida. Florida, I think, it was just south of the South. People did not look at this as part of the Cotton Belt South. So anything that happened in Florida, they're like, well, that's not even a real southern state. That's a sunshine state. You got Miami, and people couldn't figure it out. And so a lot of the things that the travesties and the injustices that were happening in Florida didn't get a lot of press. I was really surprised to see that. There's one story I write about in Devil in the Grove that's almost very similar to the Emmett Till story. Nobody knows about that one. And yet this is a case that Thurgood Marshall worked on with Harry T. Moore, and nobody knows about it. A 15-year-old kid, a young African-American who was lynched for writing a Christmas card to a white clerk at the drugstore. And so this was what was happening in Florida. Many people don't realize this, but Florida had the highest per capita rate of lynching than any of the states. It was the most dangerous state to be black in the United States, Florida. And so that does not fit Florida's narrative at all. And so that's what really interested me.
We're going to have to end this program this evening. It's about 8:20. We have to be out of the building by 9. So if you have further questions or you want to have your book signed, you're welcome to come up now. They'll be happy to do that for you. And thank you once again for being here.
Thank you very much.
Great.
I could talk to you all day and just change up the questions, but that was great. Thank you.